Hello, everyone. Tonight, let's set aside the academic topics to take a much more herbal journey together, exploring the foggy and fragrant world of medieval intoxication. That's right, they did it too, and trust me, things got weird and sometimes surprisingly creative. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely enjoy the content I create here. And let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's wonderful to know we have friends from all over the world. All right, now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for a gentle humming background, and let's relax together and begin tonight's journey. Between the divine and the demonic, the intoxicated and hallucinatory world of the Middle Ages. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often conjure a grim picture: gray castles, solemn monks, terrifying plagues, and mud-caked peasants. It was a world of ironclad faith, perpetual warfare, and harsh living. However, hidden behind that thick woolen curtain of despair was a more complex reality, a world of profound human experiences where the line between medicine, spirituality, and dangerous intoxication became unusually thin. This is the story of getting high in the Middle Ages, a journey not through the dark alleys of a modern metropolis, but through the herbal gardens of monasteries, the huts of healers, and sometimes simply through a loaf of poisoned bread. Contrary to our modern assumptions, using substances to alter perception, escape physical pain, or simply make a bad day less terrible was not uncommon. It was woven into the very fabric of the culture. However, it wasn't called getting high. There were no medieval stoner couples giggling behind a haystack. Instead, it was framed in terms like trance, divine inspiration, pain relief, or in extreme cases, demonic possession. Physicians used herbs, monks grew them, and almost everyone came into contact with these substances in some form, whether through medicine, ritual, or the accidental consumption of moldy bread. The intoxicated world of the Middle Ages wasn't limited to a tankard of warm ale. They had roots that could make one scream, flowers that blurred vision, seeds that induced prophetic dreams, and ointments that made people believe they were flying naked through the night sky. Getting high wasn't necessarily recreational. It was medicinal, spiritual, or sometimes just a terribly bad dosage calculation on an empty stomach. And depending on your social status, it could be administered by a barber surgeon, a nun, or a barefoot peasant. In that world, you didn't need a shady corner to find mind-altering substances. All you needed was a garden, a mortar and pestle, and a vague disregard for dosage. Because in those days, nature was the dealer, and she wasn't always gentle. Chapter 1. The Medieval Apothecary's Garden, a Double-Edged Sword. Medieval Europe was teeming with plants, roots, fungi, and resins that could either cure your headache or make you believe you were married to a tree. The line between medicine and a mystical trip was, shall we say, artfully interpreted. Physicians, monks, midwives, and wandering herbalists all dabbled in botany with varying degrees of training and enthusiasm. If you wanted something to help you sleep, calm your nerves, or make you see God in your soup, they had options. Henbane, Hyacinthus niger. Let's see what this button does. Henbane was perhaps the quintessential medieval herb, a plant both revered as a powerful painkiller and feared as a gateway to madness. Known to botanists as Hyacinthus niger, and to everyone else as that stuff that made Uncle Bernard think he was a duck, henbane was a staple in the era's informal pharmacopoeia. Monks documented its properties in herbals, physicians used it to dull pain, and witches, according to lore, used it to ride their broomsticks through their imaginations. So what did henbane actually do? That depended entirely on the dose. In small doses, it acted as an effective sedative. It could soothe a toothache, help with insomnia, and make childbirth slightly less harrowing. In other words, it was the medieval version of take two of these and try not to scream. It was a critical medical tool in a world without synthetic painkillers. In larger doses, however, or if simply prepared incorrectly, henbane could induce delirium, intense hallucinations, wild agitation, and in some cases, a heartfelt conversation with a turnip you thought was your deceased grandmother. The plant contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, two potent alkaloid compounds that interfere with neurotransmitters in the brain. In non-scientific terms, your medieval brain would get very weird very quickly. Symptoms included visual distortions, disorientation, dry mouth, extreme thirst, and uncontrollable fits of spontaneous dancing. Henbane was often smoked, brewed into teas, or even combined with animal fat and applied to the skin, a popular method for anyone who preferred their consciousness not to be arranged in a straight line. While technically legal, the concept of a controlled substance didn't exist. Its use was controversial, especially with the church. Anything that altered perception was viewed with suspicion. Visions were supposed to come from saints, not shrubs. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, the screaming root. Few plants in the medieval world were as feared, revered, and dramatically misunderstood as the mandrake. A potent and bizarrely human-shaped root, it inspired a mixture of botany, folklore, and pure panic. Medieval herbalists believed its root, which often resembles a stocky, twisted human figure, held powerful magical and medicinal properties. It was a sedative, an anesthetic, an aphrodisiac, and, according to some, a conduit for prophetic dreams. You could boil it in wine for pain relief, or you could inhale its fumes and immediately question all of your life choices. But mandrake's real claim to fame came from its alleged habit of screaming when pulled from the ground. Yes, screaming, in a don't pull me out of the earth or you'll die from the noise sort of way. Medieval texts warned that merely hearing the mandrake's cry could kill a man, which naturally led to some creative harvesting techniques. The most famous involved tying the root to a dog, walking away, and letting the poor animal do the dirty work. The assumption was that the dog would die in your place, a plan that raises some ethical questions even by medieval standards. Once the harvest was complete and the dog was properly mourned, the mandrake could be dried, powdered, steeped, or worn as a talisman. Some people even carried small mandrake figurines in their pockets to ward off evil spirits or promote fertility. The church, predictably, was not a fan of mandrake. Anything that induced visions without being attached to organized religion was deemed a little too close to witchcraft. Still, monks recorded mandrake recipes in their herbals with suspiciously detailed instructions. Used correctly, mandrake could dull pain before surgery, treat insomnia, and produce vivid dreams. Used incorrectly, it could cause vomiting, unconsciousness, or lead to your family staging an exorcism because you think your soup is whispering. Belladonna, Atropa belladonna, deadly beauty. If you were a medieval noblewoman hoping to turn heads at a feast, you might wear your finest linen, braid flowers into your hair, or, if you were really serious, you could literally drop poison into your eyes. This is where belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, came in. The name belladonna means beautiful lady in Italian. That's because when a few drops of its extract were applied to the eyes, it would dilate the pupils. Large, dark pupils were considered alluring, mysterious, and perhaps even a little bit holy. The downside, of course, was blurred vision, light sensitivity, and the occasional unintended death. But beauty standards have never been particularly forgiving. Beyond cosmetics, belladonna had other uses. It was employed as a pain reliever, a sleep aid, and sometimes as a truth serum, though the truth it produced was often along the lines of the ceiling is dripping Latin prayers. Like henbane, it contains atropine and scopolamine, two substances that mess with the nervous system in ways that range from mildly trippy to why is the wallpaper vibrating? Medieval self-care was a bold endeavor. Chapter 2. From Potions to Flying Ointments. Methods of Consumption. Long before modern edibles came discreetly packaged and fruit-flavored, medieval people were getting creative, just not with chocolate. Instead, they relied on ointments, salves, decoctions, and potions. And let's be clear, the word ointment rarely inspires confidence, especially when it contains ingredients like belladonna, fat from a black cat, and a questionable amount of hemlock stirred counterclockwise under a full moon. Flying ointments and the broomstick. This is one of the most infamous and misunderstood aspects of medieval witchcraft. Historical records, especially those written by inquisitors, describe witches using flying ointments, thick, trance-inducing salves made from plants like henbane, belladonna, and mandrake. But here's the key. These ointments were not ingested. Why? Because the ingredients are extremely toxic when passed through the digestive system. Instead, They were applied topically and more specifically on mucous membranes, where the chemicals could be absorbed most efficiently and directly into the bloodstream. This is where the association between witches and broomsticks comes from. The broomstick was not a literal flying vehicle. It was an applicator for applying the ointment to sensitive, highly absorbent areas. Within minutes, the user would report visions of flying through the night sky, attending Sabbaths with demons, or simply hovering over their village like the world's most confused drone. These were, of course, chemically induced hallucinations, but in an age where medicine, magic, and mysticism shared a bunk bed, no one really questioned it. The Inquisitors took this flying as proof of consorting with the devil, an ironic twist considering the visions were entirely chemical and notoriously unreliable. Chapter 3. The Accidental High, When Breakfast Fights Back. Sometimes, getting high in the Middle Ages wasn't a decision, it was just breakfast. Ergotism, the original LSD trip. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. To the untrained medieval eye, it looked like a slightly strange, dark-colored kernel. To the modern scientist, it's a biological prank with side effects that read like a medieval curse. Convulsions, hallucinations, a burning sensation in the limbs, and the occasional feeling that your hands have turned into spiders. This fungus was the accidental ingredient in what some historians call the original LSD trip, centuries before the summer of love or anything tie-dyed. People in parts of Europe, especially in colder, damper regions like France and the Germanic territories, routinely baked bread from infected rye. Why? Because hunger trumped fungal awareness. And so, entire villages would unwittingly consume ergot-laced loaves, and the results were both spectacular and horrifying. There were two forms of ergotism: the convulsive kind, characterized by muscle spasms, seizures, hallucinations, and fits of laughter or panic, and the gangrenous kind, where blood flow was cut off, leading to limbs turning black, shriveling, and falling off. Local outbreaks led to bizarre public behaviors, including dancing plagues, where groups of people would dance uncontrollably for days, sometimes to death. At the time, it was blamed on demons, God's punishment, or moral weakness. In reality, it was likely just a mass case of accidental mold ingestion. Mad honey. In a few peculiar corners of the medieval world, even the bees were in on the game. This isn't your average supermarket honey. We're talking about a rare honey produced in the Black Sea regions of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, where bees feed on rhododendron flowers. These pretty pink flowers harbor a dark secret. They contain grainotoxins, natural compounds that do not play well with the human nervous system. The result is mad honey, a substance potent enough to cause dizziness, hallucinations, vomiting, a slowed heart rate, and spiritual visions. Consumed in small doses, it delivered a mild buzz. In larger doses, it turned your day into a slow-motion opera starring your own eyebrows. According to ancient and medieval sources, invading armies were sometimes deliberately poisoned with mad honey left behind in abandoned villages. The soldiers thought they'd found free food. Instead, they ended up convulsing on the forest floor, realizing too late that nature's gifts can't always be trusted. Chapter 4. Beyond European Borders. While medieval Europe was busy smearing poison on broom handles and calling it air travel, something far more sophisticated was happening to the south and east, in the flourishing cities of the Islamic Golden Age. Hashish, the answer to existential dread. Derived from the resin of the cannabis plant, hashish was widely used in regions like Persia, Egypt, and the Levant. Unlike Europe's rub this on your elbow and meet Satan approach, Islamic scholars, mystics, and physicians actually documented its effects with a level of detail that suggests dedicated field testing. Hashish was usually consumed orally, often mixed with honey, spices, or other herbs, making it the first edible that might have actually tasted good. Its use wasn't just recreational. Hashish was often tied to Sufism, the mystical branch of Islam, where adherents sought spiritual union with God. Hashish was believed to help dissolve the ego, clear the mind, and initiate deep contemplation. Many Sufi poets and philosophers wrote about hashish the way modern musicians write about breakups, with intense emotion and abstract metaphors. Frankincense and holy smoke. When you picture a medieval cathedral, you might imagine stained glass, flickering candles, and that thick, almost surreal cloud of incense smoke wafting through the air. But frankincense wasn't just about holiness. It had a little something extra, psychoactive potential. Modern studies have shown that burning frankincense releases compounds, specifically insensitive acetate, that can affect the brain's limbic system. Translation: if you sit in enough smoke, the Gregorian chants aren't the only thing making your head feel floaty. In poorly ventilated medieval chapels, i.e., all of them, prolonged exposure to frankincense could induce a mild sedative effect, especially if combined with fasting, dehydration, or extreme boredom. It's no wonder monks or parishioners reported visions during long services, and while they usually attributed it to divine inspiration, it's possible some were just a little high on tree resin. Chapter 5. Alcohol, the Universal Savior. If there was one thing medieval people could rely on, besides taxes and the plague, it was alcohol. Beer, ale, mead, wine, cider, you name it, someone was brewing it in a wooden tub out back and calling it medicine. And in a way it was. Water wasn't really safe to drink. Most natural sources were contaminated. So instead, people turned to something that had been fermented. Small beer was the medieval version of sparkling mineral water, but with alcohol and a high probability of being brewed by someone named Edith who measured ingredients with intuition and a prayer. This low-alcohol beverage was consumed daily by adults and children alike, not to get drunk, but to stay alive with a steady buzz of hydration. Of course, not all medieval alcohol was so benign. If you were wealthier, you had your pick of stronger Alesh, meads, or imported wines. In monasteries, brewing was practically a sacred duty. Monks perfected recipes, documented fermentation methods, and taste-tested the results with great enthusiasm. Taverns and inns served as the medieval therapist's office, only with more yelling. Conclusion: miracle, misdemeanor, or medicine. After all the ointments, potions, roots, incense, bees, and questionable bread, one big question remains: how did medieval people actually feel about getting high? The answer is conflicted, deeply and hilariously so. For some, especially healers and herbalists, mind-altering substances were a practical tool. If it dulled pain, soothed a fevered mind, or made childbirth 1% less horrific, it was welcome. This was medicine, not mischief. Then there were the spiritual users. For monks and mystics, hallucinations weren't a warning sign. They were revelations. Visions were a sign of holiness, not a symptom. If you stared into the void and the void whispered back in Latin, you were on the fast track to sainthood. But intent was everything. Got high by accident? That's fine. Got high to meet Jesus? Acceptable. Got high to flirt with a goat demon? Now we have a problem. That's where the church stepped in, branding certain substances and their users as suspect, or at worst, heretical. Anything involving a loss of control made the clergy nervous. Ultimately, how a high was perceived depended on who you were, what you were using, and whether anyone snitched. In the medieval mind, altered states existed in a strange gray area between miracle and misdemeanor, between health and heresy. And in a world where demons, saints, plagues, and turnip famines all coexisted, a little herbal escapism, once in a while, could hardly have been the worst idea. Mare Nostrum, power, violence, and the legacy of ancient naval warfare. In our collective imagination, ancient warfare is often visualized through images on land. The clash of Greek phalanxes, Roman legions marching on stone roads, or chariots stirring up dust in the deserts. But the history of the ancient world, especially around the Mediterranean basin, was written not just with iron and blood on land, but with timber, sweat, and salt on the sea. The sea was not an obstacle to be crossed. It was a strategic arena, a commercial artery, and the beating heart of empires. Unlike land warfare, where terrain shapes battles, naval warfare was a fight for the control of the flow of trade, information, and military power. For maritime empires like Athens, Carthage, or later, Rome, naval supremacy was not a luxury. It was a matter of survival. A city without a fleet could be easily isolated, starved, and besieged. But with a powerful fleet, they could blockade enemies, protect merchant convoys, and land forces deep behind enemy lines. The battle for control of the sea was a high-speed, brutal chess match where technology, tactics, and iron will decided the fate of civilizations. This is the story of how ancient powers tamed the ocean, turned it into a weapon, and, in doing so, shaped the world. Chapter 1. The Trireme, a guided missile of wood and sweat. The true naval revolution of the ancient world began with an iconic warship design, the Trireme. This ship was not merely a vessel. It was a finely crafted weapon, a perfect combination of speed, agility, and destructive power. Although many city-states built them, none mastered their use as effectively as the Athenians. A typical trireme was about 37 meters, 120 feet, long, but only about 5.5 meters, 18 feet, wide. It was slender, sleek, and designed to glide across the water with minimal resistance. Its lightweight structure and shallow draft allowed it to operate close to shore for raids and landings. But the name, trireme, comes from its core feature: 3 tiers of oars stacked vertically. Seated at each oar was a highly trained rower, not a slave as is often mistakenly believed, at least in the Athenian fleet. They were citizens, the poorest who could not afford armor to fight as hoplites, but who found their role and power on the rowing benches. There were up to 170 rowers on a single ship, all moving in perfect synchrony, a rhythm dictated by the commander's flute or drum. This human engine could propel the ship to speeds of up to 9 knots, about 17 kilometers per hour or 5 miles per hour, in short bursts, making it one of the fastest and most dangerous objects on the sea. The trireme's primary weapon was the ram, a sturdy oak structure reinforced and sheathed in a thick bronze casing at the bow. This ram was designed to smash into an enemy hull with horrific force, piercing the wooden shell and creating a fatal hole below the waterline. A successful ramming could sink an enemy ship in minutes. However, the trireme was not a floating fortress. It depended on agility, not armor. On deck, there was only a small contingent of about 10 to 20 heavily armed hoplites and a few archers. Their role was to storm enemy ships when close or defend against similar attacks. One mistake in maneuvering, and the ship could easily be flanked and become prey for the enemy. What made the Athenian trireme fleet truly revolutionary was not just the ship itself, but the system behind it. Thanks to the vision of the statesman Themistocles and the vast silver resources from the mines at Laurium, Athens built and maintained hundreds of triremes. The fact that citizens, even the poorest, served as rowers forged a strange kind of maritime democracy. Their contribution gave them political influence, empowering the lower classes in the Athenian assembly. When Athens defeated the Persian fleet at Salamis in 480 BCE, it was not the aristocrats who rode to victory, but the common people. Power on the sea had become the power of the people. Chapter 2. The Brutal Dance of Naval Combat. Ancient naval warfare was not a long-range cannon duel. It was more like a high-speed chess game combined with a street brawl. The main goal was to disable or sink enemy ships before they could do the same to you. The tactics developed were both sophisticated and ruthless. The art of ramming. Ramming was the heart of naval tactics in the trireme era. As mentioned, the goal was to puncture the enemy's hull below the waterline. But it wasn't as simple as charge straight ahead. Timing, angle, and coordination were critical. If you approached at too sharp an angle, your ram would glance off the enemy hull. If you approached too head-on, your ship could become stuck, leaving both vessels vulnerable. To execute a successful ramming, fleets used complex formations and maneuvers. Deekplus, sailing through, this was a daring offensive maneuver. A line of ships would charge straight through the gaps in the enemy's formation. Once behind them, they would quickly turn and attack the unprotected flanks or sterns of the enemy ships. This required perfect coordination and immense courage. Periplus, sailing around, this tactic involved a more mobile fleet sailing around the enemy's formation, looking for weaknesses or isolated ships to pick off. These tactics were not about brute force. They were precision strikes that depended on the unity of the rowers and the foresight of the captain. Boarding, when chess becomes a wrestling match. Sometimes, plans didn't go as intended. Rams missed, ships became locked together, oars broke. That's when Plan B was deployed, boarding. This action turned a naval battle into a land-style engagement. When two ships collided or were hooked together, Marines would leap onto the enemy vessel with swords, spears, and shields. These were not elegant duels. They were brutal, close-quarters fights in a confined space, on a deck slippery with salt water, blood, and splintered wood. Archers and slingers from higher decks would add to the chaos. Some fleets, notably the Romans, eventually came to favor boarding over ramming. They even developed a special device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with a large spike at its end to hook onto an enemy's deck. This device neutralized the superior seamanship of the Carthaginians by turning naval battles into floating land engagements, where the Roman legions were masters. There was no retreat once a boarding action began. It was kill or be killed. Fire, the sledgehammer of the sea. If ramming was the scalpel of ancient naval warfare, fire was the sledgehammer. There was no more terrifying sight than a burning ship bearing down on your fleet. Fire attacks were the naval version of controlled chaos, a weapon so dangerous it often threatened the attacker as much as the enemy. The principle was simple: load an old ship with flammable materials, tar, pitch, sulfur, oil, and set it ablaze before aiming it at a crowded formation of enemy ships. In the tight confines of a harbor or a strait, a single fire ship could cause mass panic and break a formation. However, fire on the sea was a double-edged sword. The wind could shift, the flames could turn back. A poorly timed fire ship could destroy your own fleet just as easily. This is why fire attacks were often reserved for desperate moments: blockades, surprise attacks, or final battles where the risk was worth it. The psychological effect of fire on water was unparalleled. A ram could be dodged, a boarding party could be repelled, but fire spread faster than commands could be shouted. Chapter 3: The Giants of the Mediterranean. Ancient naval history was shaped by the rivalry of a few great powers, each with its own approach to sea power. Athens, the thalassocracy. In the 5th century BCE, Athens transformed itself from a land-based city-state into a dominant naval superpower. The victory at Salamis in 480 BCE, where a smaller Athenian fleet trapped and destroyed the massive Persian fleet in narrow straits, is one of the most decisive naval battles in history. That victory didn't just save Athens, it positioned the city as the protector and soon the ruler of the Aegean Sea. Under the Delian League, Athens began collecting tribute from allied city-states, ostensibly for common naval defense. In reality, this tribute was often used to fund Athens' own interests, from shipbuilding to public architecture. The fleet allowed Athens to enforce loyalty, suppress rebellions, and project its power far beyond its borders. However, this dominance came at a price. Athens' over-reliance on its navy and its coercive treatment of allies sowed resentment. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta, a historically land-based power, built its own fleet with Persian money and eventually crushed the Athenian navy. With its fleet gone, Athens was starved into submission. The legacy of Athenian sea power endured, showing that a city-state with limited land could become an imperial force through mastery of the sea. Carthage, the merchant princes of the sea. If Athens ruled the Aegean, Carthage dominated the western Mediterranean. Founded by Phoenician settlers around 800 BCE, Carthage built its power not just on conquest, but on trade, seamanship, and unparalleled naval innovation. Carthage's strength was forged by its fleet. While the Athenians refined the trireme, the Carthaginians industrialized naval engineering. Their shipyards, especially the massive circular harbor of Carthage, the Cadhon, could build and house hundreds of warships. They had an assembly line-style system of docks that allowed for rapid construction and repair, something unprecedented in the ancient world. Carthaginian ships, often quadriremes, for banks of oars, or quinquiremes, 5 banks, were heavier and more powerful than Athenian triremes, designed not just for speed but for strength. And then came the Punic Wars. Rome, a rising power on the Italian peninsula, realized that to defeat Carthage, it had to build a fleet from scratch. When they captured a beached Carthaginian quinquireme, they reverse-engineered it, complete with the corvus. Despite initial setbacks, Carthage held its own thanks to brilliant naval commanders and tactical mastery. But eventually, quantity overwhelmed quality. Rome's persistence, better supply lines, and brutal discipline turned the tide. By the end of the Second Punic War, Carthage's fleet was gone, its shipyards dismantled, and its power broken. Rome, the reluctant masters of the sea. When the Roman Republic first rose to prominence, it was not a naval power. Rome's strength lay in its disciplined legions and its talent for road building. But that changed quickly when they confronted Carthage. Rome knew it could not outsail the Carthaginians, so it changed the rules of the game with the Corvus. The results were spectacular. In battles like Mylae and Cape Ecnomus, Rome's relatively inexperienced sailors defeated veteran Carthaginian crews through sheer aggression and the effectiveness of the Corvus. The Corvus was eventually phased out because it made ships top-heavy and dangerous, but it had already turned the tide of the war. Under the Empire, Rome's control of the sea was extended even further. Imperial fleets like the Classis Missinensis and Classis Ravinatus were stationed to protect trade routes, suppress piracy, and transport armies. While not always at the forefront of war, the Navy provided critical logistical and strategic support that held the empire together. Rome may have been born on land, but its destiny was decided on the water. Through adaptation, innovation, and relentless will, they turned the sea from a weakness into a fortress. By the 1st century CE, the boast Mare Nostrum, our sea, had become a reality. Egypt, the power of the Nile. When we think of ancient Egypt, we picture pyramids and pharaohs, not fleets. But Egypt was one of the earliest civilizations to harness naval power, both on the Nile River and on the sea. The Nile was Egypt's highway, an artery connecting north and south. As early as 3000 BCE, Egyptian shipbuilders were crafting vessels from papyrus reed bundles and later, imported cedar wood. These riverboats transported grain, gold, soldiers, and even colossal statues. By the New Kingdom, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE, Egypt had developed seagoing fleets capable of challenging pirates, repelling invasions, and projecting power beyond its borders. Under rulers like Thutmose III and Ramesses III, Egypt used warships in campaigns against the Sea Peoples, a confederation of raiders threatening the eastern Mediterranean. These battles, recorded in vivid reliefs at Medinet Habu, show Egyptian archers firing from ships and marines engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. Egypt's naval power may not have dominated the open ocean, but it dominated the rhythm of the empire, sailing where the Nile flowed and where power demanded. The lasting wake. Ancient naval warfare didn't just influence battles. It shaped borders, economies, empires, and even cultures across the Mediterranean and beyond. Control of the sea meant more than victory on the water. It meant influencing the movement of ideas, trade, languages, and power structures that would echo for centuries. First, consider how fleets forged empires. Athens became a cultural and economic powerhouse on the back of its naval strength. Carthage turned its maritime mastery into a commercial empire. Rome, despite its late start at sea, used naval superiority to control the entire Mediterranean basin. The sea also served as a cultural conduit. Greek colonists traveled by ship to establish outposts, spreading their art, religion, and language. Phoenician sailors spread their alphabet and their gods to nearly every shore they touched. Technologically, ancient fleets pushed shipbuilding to new heights. The development of the trireme and later, larger polyremes was not just a military advancement. It was an engineering revolution. Harbors became logistical hubs, and navigation techniques improved. Even economic systems evolved because of fleets. Protected sea lanes allowed for stable trade over vast distances, enabling luxury goods like silk, spices, and wine to move between distant cultures. Finally, there is the psychological legacy. Fire attacks, ramming tactics, boarding actions. These left lasting impressions on how war was imagined. They introduced the idea that the sea itself could be a weapon, that mobility and control, not just brute force, could win wars. Today, we remember many of these empires for their land conquests, but their conquests at sea were just as crucial and often more enduring. Ancient naval warfare was never just about who had the fastest ship or the sharpest ram. It was about who understood the sea as a stage, not just for war, but for history itself. In the end, the triremes may be gone, but their wake still ripples through the currents of time. Cyrus the Great, the king who conquered with clemency and his immortal legacy. Ancient history has no shortage of great conquerors. Names like Alexander, Caesar, or Genghis Khan echo through the centuries, evoking images of mighty armies, bloody battles, and empires built on the edge of a sword. But there is one name, also a conqueror, that carries a different resonance. That name is Cyrus, the founder of the Achaemenid Empire of Persia. His name evokes not only military might, but also a new model of rule, a philosophy of power that changed the course of history. He was not only called the Great by posterity, but was also called Father by the peoples under his rule, and was respected even by his sworn enemies. The genius of Cyrus the Great lay not only in his ability to conquer kingdoms from Media to Babylon, but also in his revolutionary vision of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire held together not by fear, but by tolerance and respect. He proved that an empire could be both vast and benevolent, a radical idea in his time that remains relevant today. His journey from an obscure prince of a small vassal kingdom to the ruler of the known world is one of history's most compelling stories, a testament to the power of both war and compassion. Chapter 1. The Prince of Anshan, the legend of a fateful youth. Cyrus was born around 600 BCE into a world on the cusp of great change. The Near East at the time was dominated by three major powers: the mighty Median Empire to the east, the legendarily wealthy Kingdom of Lydia to the west, in modern-day Turkey, and the Neo-Babylonian Empire at the height of its power to the south. Persia, Cyrus's homeland, was then just a small kingdom called Anshan, a vassal state subject to the rule of the Medes. Nothing in Cyrus's initial circumstances suggested he would one day overthrow this order and create the largest empire the world had ever seen. His early life is shrouded in legend, with the most dramatic story recounted by the Greek historian Herodotus. According to Herodotus, King Astyages of Media, Cyrus's maternal grandfather, had a disturbing dream. He dreamed that his daughter, Mandane, gave birth to a great river that engulfed all of Asia. Dream interpreters confirmed his worst fears. This grandson would usurp his throne. To thwart the prophecy, Astyages married his daughter off to a Persian noble named Cambyses, hoping that a marriage to someone of lower status would render the child politically irrelevant. But the dreams continued. When Cyrus was born, Astyages decided to leave nothing to chance. He summoned a loyal courtier named Harpagus and ordered him to kill the baby. Harpagus, hesitant to perform such a cruel act himself, passed the grim task to a shepherd. But instead of abandoning the infant, the shepherd and his wife, moved by the baby, decided to raise Cyrus as their own, hiding him in the remote mountains. Cyrus grew up as an ordinary shepherd's child, but his leadership qualities soon emerged. The boy stood out among other children, commanding them in their games and exhibiting an authority far beyond his years. Eventually, word of a noble child living as a shepherd reached the king. Astyages investigated, and the truth was revealed. Surprisingly, he spared Cyrus's life, perhaps seeing the boy as no longer a threat, or perhaps haunted by guilt. Harpagus, however, was not so lucky. In an act of savage and barbaric revenge, Astyages had Harpagus's only son killed, then had him butchered, cooked, and served to Harpagus himself at a banquet, without his knowledge. Only after the meal was over did Astyages have the child's head and limbs brought in to show Harpagus that he had eaten his own son. This grief and hatred planted the seed for a revenge that would shake the empire. Whether Herodotus's story is fact or embellished legend, it captures the aura of destiny that always surrounded Cyrus. From his near death as an infant to his miraculous survival, his early life sowed the seeds of greatness. He would not only challenge Astyages, but would redefine the very concept of kingship. Chapter 2. The Persian Revolt, Forging an Empire from Resistance. By the mid-6th century BCE, Cyrus was no longer a hidden prince. He had become an ambitious and calculating leader, ready to challenge the regional status quo. The Median Empire, under the rule of King Astyages, still held dominion over Persia, but the balance of power was shifting. The catalyst for the revolt was betrayal. According to multiple sources, including Herodotus and the Babylonian chronicles, Harpagus, the Median general once ordered to kill Cyrus, had never forgotten the tragic fate of his son. Years later, he was in a position to act. He secretly sent messages to Cyrus, encouraging him to rebel and promising support from within the ranks of the Median army. It was the beginning of an uprising that would change the ancient world. Around 553 BCE, Cyrus officially rose in revolt. Persia, once a vassal kingdom, now declared its independence in war. What followed was not a single decisive battle, but a series of campaigns that lasted 3 years. Cyrus's forces pushed deeper into Median territory, attracting support from disaffected nobles and regional allies. His reputation grew, not just for his military competence, but for his restraint. He often spared surrendered enemies, inspiring both fear and admiration. Meanwhile, Astyages' court was crumbling, its loyalties eroded. When the final confrontation came around 550 BCE, it was Astyages' own army that betrayed him and handed him over to Cyrus. The once mighty Median Empire had collapsed almost overnight. Cyrus entered Ecbatana, the Median capital, not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a new kind of ruler. He respected local traditions, preserved Median administrative structures, and incorporated many Medes into his own growing government and army. This policy of integration would become a hallmark of his reign. By overthrowing the Medes, he not only freed Persia from vassalage but inherited their empire. He now ruled lands stretching from modern-day Iran to parts of Central Asia. But this was not the end, it was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The March Westward, the Fall of Lydia and its Richest King. After his victory over the Medes, Cyrus the Great turned his gaze westward, toward the immensely wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by the legendary King Croesus. Croesus was no ordinary king. He was one of the richest men of his age, his name having become a byword for boundless wealth. His capital, Sardis, glittered with luxury, and his army was well equipped with cavalry and seasoned soldiers. But Croesus made a fatal mistake. He underestimated Cyrus. To counter Persian expansion, Croesus formed alliances with Egypt and Babylon and consulted the oracle at Delphi. The famous oracle told him, "If you cross the Halys River to attack Persia, you will destroy a great empire." Encouraged, Croesus launched an invasion, only to discover that the empire he would destroy was his own. The two forces clashed near the Halys River in 547 BCE. After a fierce battle, Croesus withdrew to Sardis, believing the campaign season was over and he could regroup in the spring with allied reinforcements. But Cyrus did the unexpected. In a daring winter campaign, he pursued and besieged Sardis, forcing Croesus into a desperate defense. According to Herodotus, Cyrus even used a surprise tactic. He used camels to frighten the Lydian cavalry, Croesus's strongest asset, rendering them useless. Within a few weeks, Sardis fell. Croesus was captured alive. What happened next shaped Cyrus's reputation as a ruler unlike any other. Instead of executing Croesus, Cyrus is said to have spared him, even making him an advisor. The story goes that as Croesus was about to be burned alive on a pyre, he cried out the name of Solon, a Greek sage who had once warned him not to count a man fortunate until one knows how his life ends. Cyrus, moved by the story and its wisdom, ordered the flames to be extinguished. Whether legend or fact, this story reflects Cyrus's famous policy of clemency. With the conquest of Lydia, Cyrus gained control of its vast treasury and trade networks, along with the powerful Ionian Greek city-states along the Aegean coast. The fall of Croesus did not just mark the collapse of a wealthy kingdom. It confirmed Cyrus's brilliant tactical genius and his willingness to wield both war and mercy. Chapter 4. The Liberation of Babylon and the Birth of Human Rights. By the late 540s BCE, only one major power stood between Cyrus and undisputed dominion in the Near East, Babylon. Once ruled by kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon had grown into a magnificent metropolis, famed for its towering ziggurats, massive double walls, and the legendary hanging gardens. But beneath the splendor, cracks were forming. At the time, Babylon was ruled by Nabonidus, an unpopular king. His religious policies had alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, the city's chief god. He had been absent from Babylon for years, leaving the empire in the hands of his son, Belshazzar. Discontent was growing. Cyrus saw his opportunity. In 539 BCE, he launched his campaign. But unlike previous invasions marked by sieges and destruction, this was a surgical strike. Cyrus's forces defeated the Babylonian army at Opis, a key city on the Tigris River. There, they won not just with military might, but with propaganda. The Persians promised to free the people from Nabonidus's misrule, presenting Cyrus as a restorer of divine order. The most incredible part was that when Cyrus advanced on Babylon, he did so without a fight. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle and later Greek sources, the city gates were opened for him, perhaps through political negotiation, perhaps due to betrayal from within. Whatever the reason, Cyrus marched into Babylon as a liberator, not a conqueror. He honored the city's temples, participated in religious ceremonies, and declared in the famous Cyrus Cylinder that he had been chosen by Marduk himself to restore peace and justice. This document, often hailed as the world's first declaration of human rights, records his policies of tolerance, restoring shrines, and allowing exiled peoples to return to their homelands. Among the beneficiaries were the Jewish people, who had been exiled from Jerusalem by Babylonian kings decades earlier. Cyrus issued a decree allowing them to return home and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. This act was so significant that the Hebrew Bible calls him God's anointed one, Messiah, a title normally reserved for Israelite kings. The Cyrus Cylinder speaks of freedom, restoration, and legitimacy through justice, a striking contrast to the standard rhetoric of ancient rulers, who usually glorified conquest and punishment. Chapter 5. Architect of Empire and Immortal Legacy. Cyrus the Great did not just conquer a vast empire, he held it together. He ruled over an incredibly diverse world: Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Lydians, Jews, and countless other peoples, all with their own languages, gods, customs, and grievances. What made Cyrus truly great was not how far he extended his borders, but how skillfully he managed what lay within them. At the core of Cyrus's rule was a philosophy of tolerance through structure. Unlike many ancient rulers who imposed their culture and religion on conquered peoples, Cyrus adopted a decentralized model. He allowed local leaders to remain in power, local religions to flourish, and local customs to continue. Instead of crushing his subjects, he sought to win their trust. He retained and adapted the administrative systems of the Medes and Babylonians, blending them with Persian practices to create a uniquely flexible empire. Power was delegated to satraps, governors, who oversaw tax collection, security, and justice in their provinces. These officials were often chosen from local elites, but remained accountable to Cyrus's central authority. This system became the foundation of Achaemenid rule for generations. Cyrus also invested in infrastructure. He improved trade routes, the beginnings of the royal road, protected caravans, and ensured fair treatment for merchants. His empire was not just a military machine. It was an economic and cultural network that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea. The life of a great conqueror often ends on the battlefield. Around 530 BCE, Cyrus embarked on his final campaign, this time into the steppes of the northeast to confront the Massagetæ, a confederation of nomadic tribes led by the formidable Queen Tamaris. According to Herodotus, after Cyrus used a trick to defeat a portion of her army and kill her son, she swore revenge. In the climactic battle that followed, the Persians were overwhelmed and Cyrus was killed. The dramatic story tells that Tamaris found his body, beheaded it, and plunged the head into a skin bag full of blood, declaring, "Drink your fill of blood, you who were thirsty for it." While this grisly end may be legendary, it is certain that Cyrus died on this campaign. His body was eventually brought back to Pasargadae, the capital he had founded, and interred in a simple but dignified tomb that still stands today. Centuries later, Alexander the Great, another master of empire, visited Cyrus's tomb and reportedly paid his deep respects, ordering it restored after it had been desecrated. This shows the respect Cyrus inspired, even among the greatest conquerors who followed him. The enduring legacy. When Cyrus the Great died, he left behind not just a vast empire, but a political blueprint, a philosophical precedent, and a reputation so revered that even centuries later, his name still inspired awe. His influence crossed borders, creeds, and cultures, cementing him not just as a Persian hero, but as a globally admired figure. In the Hebrew Bible, he is depicted not as a pagan tyrant, but as a divinely appointed liberator. In Greece, despite centuries of conflict with Persia, Cyrus was often portrayed as a model king. The writer Xenophon wrote the Cyropaedia, a semi-fictionalized biography of Cyrus's life, presenting him as the ideal ruler, wise, just, and brave. In Islamic tradition, some scholars have identified Cyrus with Tul-Karnain, a righteous king mentioned in the Quran. In the modern era, political leaders like Thomas Jefferson were said to have kept a copy of the Cyropaedia by their bedside for inspiration. A replica of the Cyrus cylinder is displayed at the United Nations headquarters today as a symbol of tolerance and governance. The appeal of Cyrus transcends conquest. He is remembered not for his cruelty, but for his rare ability to wield power justly. He showed that an empire did not need to crush diversity to maintain control, and that rulers could win loyalty through respect rather than fear. More than 2 millennia later, Cyrus the Great remains a paradox, a conqueror praised for his compassion, a king celebrated by the very people he conquered. Few figures in history command such widespread admiration, and even fewer deserve it more. The silent language on every strand, power, belief, and identity in ancient hairstyles. Hair. To modern people, it may be just a matter of personal aesthetics, a facet of fashion that changes with the seasons. But in the ancient world, before mass media, before even widespread literacy, hair was more than just a part of the body. It was a canvas, a manifesto, a silent but incredibly powerful language. From the perfumed wigs of Egypt to the warrior braids of the Vikings, from the honor-bound topknots of samurai to the sacred locks of Indian sages, hairstyle was one of the most complex and important means of nonverbal communication. Across the diverse civilizations of the ancient world, hairstyles were used to declare social status, political allegiance, spiritual belief, and personal identity. It could distinguish the free from the enslaved, the insider from the outsider, the conformist from the rebel. The acts of caring for, styling, covering, or cutting hair were laden with meaning, governed by strict social, religious, and political codes. The scalp, quite literally, became a stage for social dramas, a battlefield for cultural values, and the last bastion of personal identity in the face of assimilation or oppression. Let us take a journey through civilizations to decipher the messages that were braided, plaited, and bunched in every strand of hair. Chapter 1. Ancient Egypt, Purity and Power in Every Wig. In the scorching sun of the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians made a bold choice. Many of them shaved their heads. This was not just a practical decision to deal with the heat and prevent lice, but also a profoundly symbolic act. A clean-shaven head was a pure canvas, and upon it, they placed one of the most sophisticated symbols of power and status, elaborate wigs. In ancient Egypt, wigs were not just fashion. They were essential markers of identity, status, and cleanliness. Men and women of the noble class didn't just wear them, they flaunted them. These were not simple accessories. They were crafted from real human hair, imported horsehair, or finely woven plant fibers. The elite often commissioned multi-layered wigs with intricate braids, adorned with gold beads, and even topped with perfumed wax cones. These cones would melt slowly in the sun, enveloping the wearer in a cloud of luxurious fragrance. Hairstyles were tied to social roles and gender. For women, an elaborate wig signified femininity, fertility, and power. A noblewoman's wig might be decorated with flowers, colorful ribbons, or clasps made of precious metal. For men, especially those serving the pharaoh, a thick, ornately styled wig reflected not only wealth, but also proximity to the divine hierarchy. Children had their own distinct style, known as the side lock of youth, a shaved head with a single, elaborately decorated braid left on the side, a symbol of childhood that would be cut off during rites of passage into adulthood. Priests were a special case. In contrast to the extravagance of the court, priests were required to shave their entire bodies, including their heads, to maintain ritual purity. However, even they might don ceremonial wigs, symbolizing their spiritual role rather than their personal identity. Even more fascinating is how wigs even served the dead. Mummies were often buried with their wigs neatly in place, ensuring their status and beauty would carry over into the afterlife. In ancient Egypt, hair was not just vanity, it was an eternal identity. Chapter 2. The Vikings, honor braided into every plait. If you picture a Viking, you likely imagine wild beards and plaited hair, an image forged from archaeology, Norse sagas, and Hollywood. And there's a surprising amount of truth to that image. Viking hairstyles were anything but random. In fact, hair was a powerful symbol in Norse society of identity, masculinity, clan loyalty, and even seduction. Both Viking men and women took great pride in their hair. In a world where appearance projected strength and honor, long hair wasn't vanity. It was a statement. Viking men often wore their hair long and styled it meticulously. Braids, top knots, and half-shaved styles were not just stylish, they were intimidating. A warrior entering battle with braided hair and a thick beard was not only being practical, keeping hair out of his eyes, he was projecting his readiness for combat and his defiance of fear. For Viking women, hair was no less symbolic. Long, well-kept hair was a sign of femininity and high status. Women often braided their hair in complex patterns, sometimes weaving in ribbons or beads. A married woman might wear her hair in a bun or partially covered to signal her marital status, similar to how a wedding ring functions today. There was even a fascinating legal aspect. In Viking law codes, cutting someone's hair without permission was considered a grave insult, an act that could lead to revenge, legal penalties, or even a full-blown blood feud. That's because hair represented honor. To humiliate a warrior by cutting his hair was to attack his very social standing. And then there was mythology. The Norse gods themselves had iconic hair. Thor with his fiery red beard, and the goddess Sif, whose golden hair was so legendary that when Loki cut it off as a prank, he had to beg the dwarves to forge a magical replacement from real gold. Here, hair was not just mortal identity, it was a divine currency. Chapter 3. Ancient Rome. Hair is a statement of citizenship and imperial propaganda. The Romans knew a thing or two about control, and that extended to their hairstyles. In a world where politics, class, and gender were all tightly regulated, hair became one of the most subtle yet powerful tools of social positioning. Let's start with Roman men. During the early Republic, the ideal Roman citizen was neat, conservative, and practical. Hair was kept short, orderly, and well-groomed. Anything longer was considered suspicious, effeminate, foreign, or lazy. A short haircut and a clean-shaven face were not just fashion choices, they were civic statements. They said, "I am disciplined, I serve the state, I am Roman." But as the empire progressed, things got more elaborate. Emperors like Nero and Commodus let their locks grow into flamboyant styles, imitating Greek philosophers or even divine statues. Some adopted what we might today call a Roman top knot, a section of hair curled or bunched at the front, sculpted to suggest intellect, youth, or sophistication. These were not accidents. They were carefully crafted public images. Hair had become a tool of propaganda. For Roman women, the stakes were even higher. Hairstyles became almost architectural. The famous Flavian Tower, a literal mountain of curls and braids pinned high above the head, was a style exclusive to the highest class, achievable only through the labor of slaves, hot irons, and hours of work. The more complex the hairstyle, the wealthier the woman, because it meant she had the leisure time and servants to maintain it. Hair could also demonstrate political loyalty. Empresses often debuted new hairstyles on statues and coins, which were then copied by upper-class women across the empire. To wear a hairstyle like the empress wasn't just flattery, it was loyalty. Meanwhile, slaves were often forced to wear short or simple hair, denying them this form of expression. So too were soldiers, who wore practical cuts that reinforced uniformity and function over ostentation. Chapter 4. Ancient Japan and China. The hair of duty, honor, and subjugation. In the Far East, hair was not just a personal attribute. It was deeply intertwined with moral philosophy, familial duty, and imperial control. In Japan, nowhere was this clearer than in the iconic chanmage, the distinctive top knot of the samurai. Originally, the chanmage began as a practical choice. The shaved pate made wearing a helmet, kabuto, more comfortable and secure in battle. But over time, as peace reigned during the Edo period, the style became less about fighting and more about identity. The top knot became a rigid symbol of warrior status, honor, and adherence to Bushido, the way of the warrior. To cut it off was not just a haircut, it was a symbolic death. A disgraced samurai could be ordered to remove his top knot, or do it himself as a sign that he was no longer worthy of his rank. The hair of Japanese women also carried powerful social messages. During the Heian period, noble women grew their hair to extraordinary lengths, sometimes longer than their own bodies, wearing it straight down their backs in the Subarakashi style. This was not just beauty, it was elegance, patience, and status. Later, in the Edo period, women's hairstyles became increasingly ornate and stylized, with styles like the shimada being coded to indicate marital status, age, or even profession. In China, hair was inseparable from the Confucian philosophy of filial piety. One of the core tenets of Confucianism was that your body, including your hair, was a sacred gift from your parents. To cut, damage, or alter it unnecessarily was a sign of disrespect. Thus, men traditionally wore their hair long and tied up in a top knot, signifying wisdom and order. This became a fiercely political issue when the Manchu-led Qing dynasty conquered the Han Chinese Ming dynasty in the 17th century. They enforced the queue hairstyle, the front of the head shaved, the rest braided into a long plait. This hairstyle was a hated symbol of submission to foreign rule. Many Han Chinese resisted, choosing death rather than betray their cultural identity. Hair had become a battlefield for national loyalty and resistance. Chapter 5. Ancient India, the sacred hair of faith and caste. In ancient India, hair was a powerful medium of both devotion and social control, tied to ritual purity, caste identity, and spiritual symbolism. The sadhus, wandering holy men who renounced worldly life, never cut, combed, or restrained their hair. Instead, they allowed it to grow into thick, matted locks called jata. These locks symbolized their spiritual power and detachment from material concerns, modeled after the god Shiva, whose hair is said to have tamed the mighty Ganges River. For others, however, a shaved head was the height of holiness. In Hindu traditions, pilgrims often shave their heads before visiting sacred sites, offering their hair as a symbol of surrender and purification. Tonsure ceremonies for funerals and a child's first haircut also carried deep meanings of renunciation and the cleansing of karma. Hair also communicated caste and marital status. High caste men traditionally retained a single tuft of hair at the crown of their head, called a shikha, after shaving the rest. This tuft marked them as twice-born, belonging to the priestly or scholarly castes. Women's hairstyles were no less symbolic, with neatly plaited braids decorated with jasmine or gold signifying discipline, beauty, and family honor. Chapter 6. Ancient Africa, a language braided into every strand. Across ancient Africa, hair was not just a personal style, it was a language. From the intricate cornrows of the Sahel to towering coiled coiffures, hairstyles served as identity cards, spiritual expressions, and even tools for survival. African hair culture is a rich tapestry of symbolism and artistry. In Nubia, queens like Amanitor wore complex braided wigs, asserting their power and beauty. In what is now Nigeria, the Yoruba and Igbo people treated hairdressing as an art form, with certain styles reserved for brides, warriors, or spiritual initiates. The Himba people of Namibia still use a red ochre paste to sculpt elaborate braids, which not only protect the hair from the desert climate, but also signify everything from puberty to marital status. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of African hair history lies in how it encoded resistance. During the transatlantic slave trade, enslaved Africans used hairstyles as forms of silent rebellion and remembrance. Cornrows were not just practical, they were maps. Certain patterns symbolized escape routes or safe meeting points. Others preserved ancestral styles from their homelands, defying the erasure of identity with every twist and plait. Hair was sacred, never just aesthetic. Hair is a canvas of resistance. Throughout ancient civilizations, when voices were silenced or swords were drawn, the scalp became a canvas of resistance. Refusing a dominant hairstyle became an act of defiance, subtle or overt, against cultural norms, imperial power, or oppressive systems. The Jews under Roman rule refused to shave their beards or style their hair in the Roman fashion, preserving a distinct identity rooted in religious observance. For them, hair was faith. The Gauls during Julius Caesar's conquest used lime to stiffen their hair, turning it into sharp crests to both terrorize their enemies and unite the tribes in resistance. When an empire fell, so too did its hairstyle. Cutting off an imperial haircut could be a dangerous but bold statement of political loyalty or dissent. Hair was not just a mirror reflecting the world, it was a tool for reshaping it. Whether a braid, a shaved head, or a curl, it could scream louder than words dared to, an immortal testament to the complexity and resilience of the human spirit.